I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
The front door of the brownstone on West 35th Street is a formidable barrier. It is designed to keep the world out, so that Nero Wolfe can keep his world in. His world consists of 10,000 orchids in the plant rooms on the roof, a kitchen where Fritz Brenner turns calories into poetry, and an office where Wolfe spends as little time as possible actually working. My job as Archie Goodwin is to make sure that the bank balance stays high enough to support the orchids, the kitchen, and the man who weighs 1/7 of a ton and rarely leaves his chair. It was a Tuesday morning shortly after 11. Wolfe had just come down from the plant rooms, having spent his usual 2 hours with Theodore Horstman and the Phalaenopsis. He was settled in his custom-built chair behind his desk, glancing through the morning mail, with the expression of a man who expected nothing but disappointment. The doorbell rang. Through the glass of the front door, I saw a woman. She wasn't just any woman. She was the kind of woman who looked like she had been designed by a committee of architects who specialized in glass and steel, sharp, polished, and very expensive. I went to the door, pulled it open, and looked at her. She was in her late 20s, wearing a suit that cost more than my first car and carrying a briefcase that looked like it held state secrets. "I am here to see Mr. Nero Wolfe," she said. Her voice had the crispness of a new $100 bill. "Mr. Wolfe is engaged," I told her, which was true. He was currently engaged in scowling at a circular from a nursery in New Jersey. "Do you have an appointment?" "My name is Elena Vane." "I don't need an appointment. I have a problem that only Mr. Wolfe can solve, and I have a retainer that will make him forget I didn't call ahead." I steered her into the front room and went into the office. Wolfe didn't look up. "A Miss Elena Vane," I said. "She has a briefcase and an attitude." She also mentioned a retainer. Wolfe roared between a grunt and a sigh. "I am reading, Archie. You're looking at a catalogue for Pete Moss. Miss Vane looks way better than Pete Moss. She says it's urgent. Urgency is a symptom of poor planning. Tell her to go away. She looks like the kind of person who doesn't go away. She looks like she owns things. Possibly us if we don't pay the taxes this month." Wolfe closed the catalogue. He hates talking about money almost as much as he hates moving. "Bring her in." Elena Vane didn't wait for an invitation. She walked into the office, took the red leather chair, and placed a small velvet-lined box on Wolfe's desk. She didn't say hello. She just opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of black silk, was a diamond the size of a walnut. It wasn't just clear, it looked like it was made of frozen light. Even Wolfe, who pretends to be unimpressed by anything that isn't edible or botanical, gave it a second glance. "The Star of Valois," she said. "Or rather, a very dangerous lie." Wolfe leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "I am not a jeweler, Miss Vane. If you wish to have a stone appraised, I can recommend several establishments. I don't need an appraisal," she snapped. "I know exactly what this is. It's a fake, a perfect high-quality synthetic. The problem, Mr. Wolfe, is that 3 days ago, this stone was sitting in the vault of my father's estate. It was real then. My father, Julian Vane, died a week ago. He was murdered." I saw Wolfe's left eyelid flicker. "That's the equivalent of a normal man jumping out of his skin." Not because of the murder. Wolfe finds murder mess up because she had used a name he didn't like. Or perhaps it was the disruption of his morning. "The police," Wolfe said, "have a department for murder. They also have one for theft. The police think my father died of a heart attack. They think the stone is real. If I go to them now, the person who did this will disappear, and the reputation of the Vane family will be ruined. I want the truth, Mr. Wolfe. I want to know who walked into a locked room, killed my father without leaving a mark, and swapped a $10 million diamond for a piece of lab-grown glass." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a check. She slid it across the desk. It had a lot of zeros. Wolfe looked at the check, then the diamond, then me. I knew that look. It was the look he gave a particularly difficult crossword puzzle. "Archie," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "It seems we are in the jewelry business." Wolfe leaned his massive frame back in his custom chair and let out a breath that was halfway to a sigh. He rang for Fritz to bring beer. The disruption of his morning had officially shifted from a nuisance to a case, and that required a change in posture, though not a change in location. Miss Vane, Wolfe said, a laboratory-grown diamond does not spontaneously manifest inside a locked vault. It requires human intervention and intimate knowledge of your late father's security. You say he was murdered. If the coroner declared it a heart attack, the killer employed a method as flawless as the fake stone currently on my desk. Who had the combination? Elena did not blink. Only 3 people knew. Myself, my father's business partner, Arthur Pendleton, and his personal secretary, Silas Red. But that isn't the whole list of who was in the house. Fritz entered with a tray holding 3 bottles of beer and a glass. He set it on Wolfe's desk, shot a suspicious glance at the briefcase and the fake gem, and vanished back toward the kitchen. Wolfe poured the beer, watching the foam rise. "Go on," Wolfe murmured, taking a sip. "We were hosting a weekend gathering at the estate," Elena explained, her voice steady. "It was a celebration of a new merger. Pendleton was there. Silas Red was managing the logistics. My younger brother Leo flew in from London, bringing his usual trail of bad attitudes. And Marcus Thorne. He's an independent appraiser my father kept on retainer. I sat at my desk, my pen moving as I took down the names. 4 men and a woman before me. 5 suspects. It was a neat, tight circle, exactly the kind of knot Wolfe hated untangling because it meant dealing with human emotions and alibis. "And the stone?" Wolfe asked. "Why was it out of a bank vault?" "A $10 million gem does not belong in a country house. My father was sentimental," she replied. "The Star of Valois was his pride. He had a specialized safe built into his study floor. He told everyone the combination was a secret, but he was getting older. He wrote things down, he made mistakes. Any of the men I named could have found his notes or guessed the sequence if they had time." Wolfe's shoulders shifted a fraction. "You admit yourself. You knew the combination." "I have $10 million of my own," she said coldly. "And I loved him. I didn't need to steal from him, and I didn't need to kill him. Wealth is not an inoculation against greed," Wolfe observed. "But we leave your motives aside. Your father dies. A doctor signs a certificate. When did you open the safe?" "Yesterday," Elena said. "I went to retrieve his will. I saw the stone in its box. To anyone else it would look identical, but I spent summers working in the cutting rooms in Antwerp. The refraction was off. The internal fire was too perfect. I took it to a friend who runs a spectrometer. It is synthetic. The swap happened recently. And you concluded it was murder. My father had a clean bill. Doctors said his heart just stopped, but the theft and his sudden death are impossible to ignore. Someone killed him to buy time to sell the real stone before anyone noticed it was gone." Wolfe stared at the synthetic diamond. The sacred peace of the office had been thoroughly violated, replaced by the scent of ambition and foul play. "Archie," Wolfe said. "Yes, sir," I answered. "Put that piece of glass in the safe. Miss Vane, you hired me to find a murderer and a diamond. I will do so, but my methods are my own. You will not dictate my pace, and you will not conceal a single detail." "I understand," she said, standing up. "What do you need me to do?" "Nothing. Go home. Wait. Do not tell the police. Archie will begin his inquiries." She nodded once, picked up her briefcase and left. I picked up the velvet box and looked at the fake gem. "Are we really taking a case involving a country house murder?" I asked. Wolfe closed his eyes. "We are, Archie, because her check is authentic." Wolfe's instructions were absolute. Gather the puzzle pieces without letting anyone know we were building one. I couldn't march into the precinct and ask for the official file on the man's sudden demise. Nor could I announce that the legendary Star of Valois currently resided in our safe as worthless imitation glass. I had to be subtle, a word Wolfe claims I do not understand. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, I was walking into the towering chrome and glass lobby of the corporate headquarters on 5th Avenue. If the brownstone was meticulously designed to keep the loud world out, this skyscraper was aggressively designed to remind the world exactly who owned it. I confidently told the head receptionist I was an independent insurance investigator finalizing the routine life policy payout. It was a relatively flimsy cover story, but people caught in the middle of corporate grief or panic rarely paused to check credentials. My first target was Arthur Pendleton, Julian's senior business partner. His office was on the highest floor, a sprawling executive suite that smelled of rich leather and expensive cigars. Pendleton was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with thick silver hair and an expertly tailored suit. When I introduced myself, he offered a firm handshake, but his dark eyes were constantly darting toward the heavy mahogany door. "It is a profound tragedy," Pendleton said, nervously pacing behind his massive oak desk. Julian was the absolute heart of this firm. We had just formally secured the new merger. Now, I have to steer the ship alone, and the board of directors is completely terrified of the market reaction. "You must have been close," I observed, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "Like brothers," he said softly, but his jaw tightened. Brothers who fought, no doubt. My morning research revealed that Pendleton's personal finances were heavily leveraged. The new merger would financially save him, but only if he had total, undisputed control. His partner's sudden departure was incredibly convenient. Before I could press him further, the office door swung open violently. A younger man walked in, completely ignoring my presence. He possessed the sharp features of his sister Elena, but where she was icy and composed, he was an erratic live wire. This was Leo, the younger brother who recently arrived from London. "Arthur, we absolutely need to talk about the estate," Leo demanded, leaning heavily on the desk. "The family lawyers are freezing all my accounts until the probate clears. I need a significant advance today." Pendleton glared at him. "This is neither the time nor the place, Leo, and you know your father's strict instructions." "My father is dead," Leo snapped, his voice dripping with obvious resentment. "And his absurd obsession with that ridiculous diamond means the bulk of our liquid assets are completely tied up." I cleared my throat. "Fascinating family dynamics. I will leave you gentlemen to it." Leo finally noticed me, his eyes narrowing sharply. "Who the hell are you?" "Insurance," I lied cheerfully, just ticking the mandatory boxes. I slipped out of the tense office and made my way down the quiet hall to find Silas Reed, the personal secretary. If Pendleton was the muscle and Leo was the headache, Silas was the silent machinery. His office was small, organized, and completely devoid of personal touches. Silas was a thin, pale man who looked like he ironed his socks. "I assure you, everything is in perfect order," Silas said, his voice a flat whisper. I managed his schedule and the complex logistics of the weekend gathering. "Including the guest list?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. Of course. It was an intimate affair. Family, Mr. Pendleton and Mr. Thorne, Marcus Thorne, the appraiser. Why was he there? Silas hesitated, a brief flicker of genuine nervousness crossing his face. He was asked to verify insurance documents regarding the Star of Valois, a standard procedure. Standard perhaps, but it placed a world-class gem expert within 50 feet of the safe the night a perfect replica was swapped for the real thing. Thorne had the specialized knowledge, Silas had the unmonitored access, Leo had the financial desperation, and Pendleton had the corporate ambition. 4 men, all present, all with something massive to gain. I thanked Silas and took the elevator to the crowded street. The afternoon air was bitterly cold, but my mind was moving fast. They were a gallery of ambition, each holding a piece of truth, and each of them was lying. I headed back to the brownstone to give Wolfe the bad news. The brownstone was a sanctuary of simmering aromas when I returned. Fritz was in the kitchen, orchestrating a complex symphony involving a saddle of veal and fresh tarragon. I went straight to the office, but the oversized custom chair behind the desk was empty. A glance at the clock told me it was 3:15. Wolfe was up in the plant rooms, surrounded by his precious orchids and Theodore Horstman, and interrupting him there was a firing offense, unless the building was actively ablaze. I sat at my desk, pulled my notebook, and began typing up my summaries of Arthur Pendleton, Leo, and Silas Reed. By the time the private elevator hummed at exactly 4 o'clock, I had 3 neat pages detailing their respective brands of desperation and deceit. Wolfe entered, crossed the room with the measured tread of a man who calculates the caloric cost of every step, and lowered himself into his chair. He rang for beer before looking at me. "Well, Archie?" he asked. I gave it to him straight, omitting nothing. I described Pendleton's heavily leveraged finances, Leo's aggressive panic over the frozen accounts, and the completely bloodless precision of Silas Reed. Wolfe listened with his eyes half closed, tracing a slow circle on his desk with a thick finger. "A predictable assortment of vultures," Wolfe murmured as Fritz arrived with the beer. "But vultures only scavenge. They do not hunt." To pull off a flawless substitution in a locked safe requires more than mere ambition. It requires specific, specialized knowledge. Marcus Thorne, I said, the appraiser. Silas confirmed Thorne was at the estate that weekend, supposedly verifying insurance documents. He had the expertise to recognize the real stone and procure the fake. Exactly, Wolfe said, pouring his beer with infinite care. A $10 million diamond is not easily fenced, Archie. It must be cut, or it must be sold to a private buyer who asks no questions. Mr. Thorne is the only man on your list with the connections to arrange either. Find him. See how he is spending his afternoon. 40 minutes later, I was walking down West 47th Street. The Diamond District is a frantic, clustered vein of immense wealth packed into a single block. Thorne's office was on the third floor of a dingy building that looked entirely unsuited to house millions of dollars in precious gems. I bypassed the main elevator and took the stairs, preferring to arrive without an electronic announcement. The frosted glass door bore his name in faded gold lettering. I didn't knock. I turned the knob smoothly and stepped inside. The outer reception area was empty, but I heard the frantic rustle of paper from the back room. I moved silently across the worn carpet and peeked around the doorframe. Marcus Thorne was a slight, balding man in his late 40s, and he was currently engaged in the act of panicking. He had a large leather suitcase open on his desk, and he was hastily tossing files, a velvet jeweler's roll, and stacks of banded currency into it. He did not look like a man preparing for a routine appraisal. He looked like a man preparing to catch the first flight to a country without an extradition treaty. Before I could step in and offer to help him pack, the heavy outer door of the office rattled and burst open. I flattened myself against the wall, perfectly concealed in the shadow of the hallway. Heavy, urgent footsteps crossed the reception area. "Marcus, you absolute fool," a sharp, familiar voice hissed. It was Leo, and spun around, dropping a stack of $100 bills. "Leo, you shouldn't be here. I told you, the timeline is completely ruined. The old man dying wasn't part of the arrangement. The police are going to start asking questions any day now. The police think it was a heart attack," Leo snapped, moving closer. "You are the only loose end. Where is the money from the initial buyer? You promised me my half today. My accounts are frozen, and Pendleton is trying to push me out completely." "The buyer backed out," Thorne's voice cracked. "When Julian died, the buyer panicked. They think it's too hot. I don't have your money, Leo. I have to leave before they realize the stone in the safe is synthetic." I had heard exactly enough. I stepped out of the shadows, leaned casually against the doorframe, and smiled at the two conspirators. "Afternoon, gentlemen," I said cheerfully. "I hope I'm not interrupting your travel plans, Mr. Thorne. But Mr. Wolfe would simply hate it if you left town without saying goodbye." Leo and Thorne both froze as if I had just dumped a bucket of ice water over their heads. Thorne's hands remained buried in his suitcase, clutching a stack of currency, while Leo's face turned a shade of white that would have made a ghost look tan. I kept my hands visible but stayed loose, leaning against the doorframe with the kind of relaxed confidence that usually makes guilty people start talking way too fast. It's a trick I learned from years of watching Wolfe handle the psychological side of things from the safety of his office, though I am the one who has to do it while standing in a room with a desperate man holding a heavy paperweight. "Goodwin," Leo hissed, his voice finally finding its way back up his throat. "I told you at the office to stay out of my family's business. This is a private matter between business associates. You have no right to be here, and you certainly have no authority to stop anyone from leaving." "I am not stopping him," I said, giving Thorne a friendly nod. "I am just suggesting that a man with a suitcase full of cash and a sudden urge to visit South America might look a little suspicious to the boys at the precinct. Mr. Wolfe, on the other hand, is a private citizen with a very high appreciation for the truth and an even higher appreciation for not having his time wasted. He wants to see you both. Think of it as an invitation to a very exclusive party where the only refreshment is a long talk about synthetic diamonds." Thorne looked like he was about to faint. "I didn't kill him. I swear to God, Leo, tell him. The plan was just the swap. The heart attack was a coincidence, a horrible, miserable coincidence that ruined everything." "Shut up, Marcus," Leo snapped, but the fire was gone from his eyes. He looked at me, then at the suitcase, then back at me. He knew the game was up. I marched them both out of the office, making sure Thorne's suitcase stayed in my grip. I didn't want any sudden donations to the Manhattan Street Cleaning Fund. When we arrived back at the brownstone, the atmosphere had changed. The smell of the veal had deepened, and the house felt heavy with an impending storm. I ushered the two men into the front room and told them to wait under the watchful eye of the portrait of Wolfe's mother. Then I slipped into the office to report to the boss. Wolfe was at his desk, but he wasn't looking at catalogues. He was staring at a small porcelain jar on his desk, a jar that usually lived in the kitchen and contained a very specific blend of peppercorns that Fritz guarded with his life. Wolfe's face was a mask of cold, concentrated fury. "Archie," he said, his voice a low rumble that usually preceded a landslide. "Look at this." I walked over and peered at the jar. To a casual observer, it looked fine. But I knew this office better than I knew the back of my hand. The jar was half an inch to the left of where it belonged, and there was a faint, nearly invisible smudge on the polished wood of the desk nearby. "Someone was in here," I said, my voice dropping, while I was in the Diamond District. "Fritz was in the cellar for 10 minutes, fetching the wine for dinner," Wolfe said. The front door was locked, but the service entrance was momentarily unattended. "Someone didn't just enter this house, Archie. They moved my things. They searched my desk. They had the audacity to handle my property with their grubby, prying fingers." "Did they take the diamond? The fake one?" "No," Wolfe said, his eyes flashing. "They didn't take anything. They were looking for something they didn't find. Or perhaps they were leaving something behind. But the sanctity of this room has been violated. The intrusion was brief, professional, and utterly insulting." I told him about catching Leo and Thorne, but Wolfe barely seemed to hear me. His mind was focused on the dirt and displaced jar. To Wolfe, a murder in a country house was a professional problem, but a stranger moving a jar in his office was a personal declaration of war. He didn't care about the $10 million anymore, he cared about the trespass. "Bring them in," Wolfe commanded, his voice like grinding stones. "Not just the two you caught. All of them," call Pendleton, call the secretary read. "Tell them that if they are not in this office within the hour, I will turn over the Star of Valois and the evidence of its manufacture to Inspector Kramer before sunset." "But we don't have the real stone yet, sir," I pointed out. "We have something better," Archie, Wolfe said, his fingers drumming a rhythmic, lethal beat on the desk. "We have the killer's desperation. They have made the mistake of bringing their filth into my home. Now, they will pay for the privilege." The clock on the mantel ticked with a heavy, rhythmic finality that seemed to grate on everyone's nerves but Wolfe's. I had spent the last 40 minutes on the telephone, and the results were now sitting in various states of agitation in the front room. Pendleton had arrived first, blustering about legal repercussions and his busy schedule, followed shortly by Silas Red, who looked even more like a funeral director than he had that morning. With Leo and Thorne already in custody, the set was almost complete. I went back into the office to find Wolfe still staring at that displaced peppercorn jar. He hadn't moved an inch, but the atmosphere around him was electric. He looked like a mountain that was considering an eruption but hadn't quite decided on the direction of the lava. "Saul Panzer is on his way," I said, leaning against the edge of my desk. I caught him just as he was sitting down to dinner. "He'll be at the service entrance in 10 minutes. I told him we had a trespasser and a missing original." Wolfe nodded once, a sharp, minimal gesture. "Good. Saul will look at the exterior. No one enters this house unnoticed twice, Archie. The first time was a failure of vigilance, the second would be a catastrophe of character." "You think the one who tossed the office is the one who took the stone?" I asked. "The two actions are inextricably linked," Wolfe murmured. "The swap was the prologue. The Julian Vane death was the complication. The intrusion into this room is the climax. Someone is looking for the counterfeit, Archie. They realize too late that the fake is just as dangerous as the real gem because it serves as a physical map of their conspiracy." Before I could reply, the doorbell rang again. This time it wasn't a suspect. It was a Delivia plain man in a nondescript jacket who handed me a heavy envelope and disappeared back into the fog that was beginning to roll off the Hudson. I opened it and whistled. Inside were photocopies of wire transfers from a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Saul's preliminary work, I noted, sliding the papers onto Wolfe's desk. It looks like our friend Silas Red hasn't been living on a secretary's salary. He's been moving large sums into an account labeled for archival research. That's a lot of dusty books. Wolfe glanced at the numbers. Discrepancies in wealth are the fingerprints of the unimaginative. But look closer at the dates, Archie. The largest transfer occurred 6 months ago, long before the weekend at the estate, long before the stone was swapped. I frowned, looking at the columns. So the theft wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a planned exit strategy. Precisely. And yet, the intruder today was frantic. One does not move a spice jar unless one is in a state of extreme tactical disarray. I heard a soft knock at the back door. Saul Panzer. I went to let him in. Saul is the best operative in the business because he looks like a man yowled forget 5 seconds after passing him on the street. He slipped inside, his eyes scanning the hallway. Someone was watching the house from the tail end of the block. Archie, Saul said, his voice low and steady. A grey sedan. When I circled back, they burned rubber heading toward the park. I didn't get the plate, but I got a look at the driver. Dark coat, heavy set. Could be a pro, could be a very nervous businessman. Pendleton has a grey sedan, I whispered. I saw it in the corporate garage. Then the pressure is working, Wolfe called out from the office. The circle is closing, and the inhabitant of that car is beginning to realize that the brownstone is not a place where secrets go to hide, but where they are dragged into the light. Archie, bring them in, all of them, and tell Fritz to prepare the beer. I find that men are more inclined to betray themselves when they are forced to watch me enjoy a beverage they are not offered. I walked into the front room. The 4 men looked up as one a portrait of guilt, fear, and cold calculation. Leo was shaking, Thorne was sweating, Pendleton was fuming, and Red was a mask of stone. "Step this way, gentlemen," I said, putting on my best usher's grin. "Mr. Wolfe is ready to perform the autopsy on your reputation. Please try not to trip over each other's lies on the way in." The office was heavy with the smell of old books and the faint, sharp scent of the cleaning fluid Fritz had used to scrub the smudge from Wolfe's desk. I arranged the chairs in a semicircle facing the oversized throne where Wolfe sat, his fingers interlaced over his center of gravity. He didn't look like a detective, he looked like a judge who had already decided on the sentence and was merely waiting for the paperwork to catch up. I took my place at my desk, notebook ready, while Saul Panzer stood by the door, a silent reminder that the exit was currently a privilege, not a right. Arthur Pendleton took the center chair, his face a mottled shade of red that suggested his blood pressure was fighting with his collar. "This is an outrage, Wolfe. I have a board meeting in an hour, and you have my business associates and family friends held here like common criminals. If you think a fancier dress and a reputation for being eccentric protects you from a lawsuit for false imprisonment, you are sadly mistaken." Wolfe didn't even blink. He opened a bottle of beer, poured it with agonizing slowness, and waited for the head to settle. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr, "you are not here because of my reputation. You are here because you are a man who has built a cathedral of debt and used your partner's death as the cornerstone. Your board meeting is a desperate attempt to finalize a merger before the executors of Julian Vane's estate realize that $10 million of the firm's collateral is currently sitting in my safe in the form of a glass trinket." The room went deathly silent. Thorne let out a whimpering sound and Leo's eyes darted toward the window. "The Star of Valois was swapped," Wolfe continued, eyes moving to Marcus Thorne. "Mr. Thorne provided the expertise and the synthetic replacement. He was paid a substantial sum to ensure the forgery was perfect enough to pass a casual inspection during the probate process. But something went wrong. The diamond's owner died prematurely. Heart attack, doctors said. A convenient cessation of the one heart that truly cared about the gem's authenticity. "I didn't kill him," Thorne shouted, leaning forward. "I told you. It was supposed to be a long-term play. We were going to replace it, sell the real one abroad, and cover the tracks with the merger funds." "And who is we?" Wolfe asked, his gaze shifting to Silas Reed. The secretary didn't move. He didn't even seem to be breathing. "Mr. Reed, you have been remarkably quiet. For a man who has been funneling thousands of dollars into offshore accounts for 6 months, your lack of protest is quite revealing. You provided the access. You knew the safes combination because you were the one who helped Julian Vane record it when his memory began to fail. You were the inside man. You have no proof of that, Reed said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. I have the proof of your intrusion, Wolfe snapped, his voice suddenly cracking like a whip. One of you was foolish enough to enter this house today while Mr. Goodwin was out. You were looking for the synthetic stone. You realized that, as long as I held that forgery, I held the evidence of the specific laboratory that created ITA laboratory that can be traced back to the buyer who commissioned it. You searched my desk. You moved my property. In your haste, you left a trace of the very grease used to maintain the high-performance engine of a grey sedan. A sedan that Mr. Panzer saw idling outside just moments ago. Pendleton's hands began to shake. I wanted to see if you actually had it. I didn't know about the money Reed was taking. I just needed the stone to secure the loans. The positioning of your lies is almost as clumsy as your physical trespassing, Wolfe said, leaning forward. You all sought to profit from the vacuum left by a man's death, but you made one fatal error. You assumed that by stealing the light from the Star of Valois, you could keep yourselves in the dark. Archie, give me the folder Saul brought. I handed him the papers. Wolfe didn't look at them, he just held them up like a threat. The pressure has been applied. The cracks are forming. Now, we shall see which of you shatters first when the police arrive to discuss the matter of a natural heart attack that occurred at the exact moment a fortune vanished. He turned his eyes back to the group. One of you killed him, not for the diamond, but because he caught you in the act of swapping. And I know exactly which one of you couldn't afford to let him speak. The office was now a pressure cooker, and Wolfe was the man with his hand on the valve. The suspects were huddled in their chairs, the initial bravado of Pendleton and the frantic energy of Leo having curdled into a cold, stagnant dread. Even the air seemed heavier, thick with the scent of Wolfe's beer and the unwashed fear of 4 men who had spent their lives believing they were smarter than the consequences of their actions. Wolfe sat perfectly still, a mountain of granite in a tailored suit, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. He knew, as I did, that a man can only hold his breath for so long before he has to gasp, and in that gasp, the truth usually hitches a ride. You speak of a heart attack, Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated through the floorboards. A convenient medical miracle. A man of 60, in relatively good health, simply ceases to be. The doctors were satisfied because they saw what they expected to see, an aging heart failing under the weight of a high-stress lifestyle. But they were not looking for the specific, minute evidence of an external catalyst. They were not looking for the presence of a substance that leaves no trace in a standard autopsy, but causes a sudden, violent electrical failure of the cardiac muscle. A substance, Mr. Reed, that is frequently used in the very chemical processes required to stabilize synthetic diamond structures during their final polishing. Silas Reed's face didn't just go pale, it seemed to turn translucent, revealing the hollow architecture of a man who had sold his soul in increments. He tried to speak, but only a dry clicking sound emerged from his throat. The swap was not the end of the plan, Wolfe continued, his eyes locked on the secretary. It was merely the midpoint. You, Mr. Thorne, and Mr. Pendleton were in a temporary alliance of greed. You needed the merger to hide the theft, and you needed the theft to fund your exits. But Julian Vane was more perceptive than you credited. He didn't just have a sentimental attachment to the Star of Valois, he had a deep technical understanding of it. He visited his vault on that final night, not to admire the stone, but because he had noticed a microscopic discrepancy in the insurance papers Mr. Thorne had prepared. He caught you, didn't he, Silas? He found you at the safe, and in that moment your carefully constructed future vanished. You didn't panic with a knife or a gun. You were much more precise. You used the tool you had brought for the Diamanda concentrated solution, intended for the gem, applied to his skin during the struggle. A struggle that you disguised as a simple collapse. You can't prove that, Reed whispered, his voice finally returning as a ghost of itself. The body has been buried. The evidence is gone. The body is irrelevant, Wolfe snapped. The evidence is in desperation. Why did you come here today, Silas? Why did you risk entering this house? It wasn't to find the fake diamond. You knew Pendleton was already watching the house from his car, playing the fool as always. You came here because you realized that in your haste to clean the study, after the murder, you lost something, a small glass vial. You thought perhaps it had fallen near the safe, or perhaps it had been swept up in the confusion and somehow ended up among the items Elena Vane brought to me. You searched my desk not for a $10 million gem, but for a 1-ounce bottle of death that bears your own fingerprints. Wolfe turned his gaze to me. Archie, show him the vial. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, amber glass container I had recovered from the corner of the front room rug, just behind the chair where Elena had sat. I hadn't told anyone I found it. I had been waiting for the right moment to let it catch the light. As I held it up, Reed's composure didn't just crack, it shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. He lunged forward, not toward me, but toward the door, only to find Saul Panzer's hand on his chest, as immovable as a brick wall. "The police are in the hallway, Mr. Reed," Wolfe said, leaning back as if the entire ordeal had been nothing more than a tedious lesson in grammar. "And unlike the doctors at the estate, they will find traces of that solution on the lining of your coat pocket. You were so concerned with the diamond that you forgot that even a fake stone can cast a very long shadow. You didn't just kill a man for a gem, you killed him because you were too small to face the truth of your own failure. Archie, get the door." I believe Inspector Kramer has seen enough through the crack to lose his patience. The office door swung open, and the silence of the brownstone was replaced by the familiar, heavy tread of the law. The game was over, and as always, Wolfe didn't even have to stand to win it. The transition from a quiet office to a precinct booking room is always a jarring one. But for the inhabitants of the brownstone, the departure of the law is the only way to restore the natural order. Inspector Kramer stayed long enough to growl at Wolfe about withholding evidence, specifically the amber vial ID found, but Wolfe merely pointed out that a discovery made in one's own front room by an employee is hardly a matter for the police until the owner of the house has had time to reflect on its significance. Kramer didn't buy it, but with Silas Red in handcuffs and Marcus Thorne singing like a canary to avoid a murder charge, he didn't have much room to complain. He took his suspects, he took the synthetic diamond, and he took the heavy atmosphere of the corporate boardroom with him, leaving us with nothing but the scent of expensive cigars and the cooling remains of Wolfe's second bottle of beer. Elena Vane remained in the red leather chair long after the sirens had faded into the distance of the New York night. She looked smaller now, the architectural perfection of her suit softened by the realization that her father's death hadn't been a tragedy of nature, but a calculated execution by the man he had trusted most. She stared at the empty spot on the desk where the fake star of Valois had rested. It was a strange victory. She had the truth she had paid for, but the gem was still gone, and her father was still in the ground. "The real stone, Mr. Wolfe," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Reed didn't have it. Thorne said the buyer backed out. If it wasn't in the safe, and it wasn't with them, then where is it? My father wouldn't have just lost it." Wolfe adjusted his position, his chair creaking under the shift of his immense weight. He looked at her with an expression that might have been pitiful if Wolfe were capable of such a common emotion. "Your father was a man of high intelligence, Miss Vane. He realized he was being encircled by vultures long before the final night. He saw the discrepancies in the insurance filings Thorne was presenting. He saw the shifting loyalties of Silas Red. He knew the vault was no longer a sanctuary." "Then where did he put it?" she asked. "Archie," Wolfe directed, "please bring me the small leather-bound volume from the third shelf, fourth from the left, the one titled A History of Rare Botanical Pigments." I did as I was told. I had seen that book 1,000 times, but I had never seen Wolfe actually read it. It was a dull, heavy thing that looked like it had been printed during the Civil War. I handed it to Wolfe, who didn't open it. Instead, he turned it over and pressed a specific point on the spine. A hidden latch clicked, and the back cover slid away to reveal a hollowed-out compartment. Inside, wrapped in a simple piece of white linen, was the real star of Valois. The room seemed to brighten as the light hit the facets of the genuine diamond. It didn't have the aggressive, artificial perfection of the synthetic. It had a depth, an ancient fire that seemed to hold the history of the earth within its crystal lattice. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Your father came to me 2 weeks ago," Wolfe said, his voice quiet. "He didn't come as a client, but as a man seeking a repository for a truth he wasn't yet ready to face. He asked me to hold this curiosity for him while he conducted an internal investigation. He knew that if he kept it in the house, it would be stolen. If he put it in a bank, the paper trail would alert his enemies. He chose the one place in New York where no one looks for anything, a book about plants in the office of a man who never leaves his house. He knew," Elena breathed, reaching out to touch the stone. "He suspected," Wolfe corrected. "He was a strategist, Miss Vane. He placed the bait himself and the Sapphato Sea who would strike. He simply underestimated the ruthlessness of the man who served his coffee. He paid me a retainer then, which I have kept. The check you gave me this morning will be returned to you minus my expenses for Mr. Goodwin's footwear and Mr. Panzer's evening." He slid the diamond across the desk. It looked small on the vast expanse of polished wood, but it represented the weight of a family's legacy and the cost of a killer's soul. Elena took it, her fingers trembling. She looked at Wolfe, then at me. For the first time since she had walked through our door, she looked like she could breathe. The mystery of the gem was solved, not through a chase or a shootout, but through the simple, logical understanding that a man who loves his treasures will always find the most boring place in the world to hide them. Justice had been delivered with the same clinical precision as a botanical entry in one of Wolfe's journals. The departure of Elena Vane left a vacuum in the office that was quickly filled by the comforting domestic sounds of the brownstone settling for the night. The front door had clicked shut with a definitive note of finality, and the street outside was silent once more. I watched from the window as her car pulled away, the taillights disappearing into the New York mist like two fading embers. When I turned back, Wolfe was already engrossed in the evening ritual. He had cleared the documents from his desk, the checkbook was put away, and he was staring at the space where the Star of Valois had recently ignited the room with its ancient, cold fire. To anyone else, it was a $10 million miracle. To Wolfe, it had been a primary source of irritation that was now, thankfully, someone else's problem. Fritz appeared in the doorway, his face glowing with the quiet pride of a man who knew his timing was impeccable. "Dinner is served, Mr. Wolfe. The veal is at its absolute peak." Wolfe stood up, a process that always reminded me of a large ship weighing anchor. He didn't head for the dining room immediately. Instead, he walked over to the bookshelf and returned the hollowed-out volume on botanical pigments to its rightful place. He adjusted it by a fraction of an inch until it was perfectly flush with its neighbors. The office was restored. The violation of the spice jar had been scrubbed away, the intruder was in a cell, and the balance of his world had been tipped back into its proper alignment. "A diamond, Archie," Wolfe said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room, "is a remarkably foolish thing for which to forfeit a life. It is carbon. It is a geological accident that humans have imbued with a value far beyond its utility. It cannot be eaten, it cannot be planted, and it provides no warmth. Yet, men like Silas Red will dismantle their own humanity for the sake of owning its reflection. It kept the lights on for another month, though," I said, leaning against my desk and watching him. "And it gave you an excuse to show off for Inspector Kramer. That has to be worth something in the utility column." Wolfe made a sound that was almost a chuckle, but stopped just short of committing to it. "Justice is the only utility I recognize in these matters. The gem was merely the bait. Julian Vane did not leave that stone with me because he trusted my safe. He left it because he trusted my inertia. He knew that I am a man who stays put, and in a world of shifting loyalties and frantic movement, there is a certain security in a fixed point." We moved into the dining room, where the table was set with the kind of precision that would make a diamond cutter look like a hobbyist. The silver gleamed under the soft light, and the aroma of the veal, seasoned with the very peppercorns that had nearly sparked a war earlier that afternoon, filled the air. Wolfe took his seat and waited for Fritz to perform the first pour of wine. There was no murder story here. There was no mention of the grey sedan or poison amber vial. Those were the messy leftovers of a world that didn't understand the value of a well-ordered life. "You know," I said, unfolding my napkin, Elena Vane actually thanked me on the way out. She said she was surprised that a man who weighs as much as a small planet could move so fast when it came to a moral corner. Wolfe looked at me over the rim of his wine glass, his eyes sharp and unblinking. Movement is a relative concept, Archie. I did not move at all. I simply waited for the world to realize that it was out of step with the truth. If Miss Vane found the experience illuminating, that is her prerogative. I, however, find it exhausting. I expect the orchids will require a great deal of my attention tomorrow to compensate for this intellectual slumming. Whatever you say, boss, I replied, reaching for the bread. But you have to admit, it was a better show than the Pete Moss catalogue. Wolfe didn't answer. He was already busy with the veal, his mind having transitioned from the cold facets of a diamond to the much more important business of a perfect sauce. The case was closed, the bank account was healthy, and for the moment, the brownstone was exactly what it was meant to be, a fortress of quiet intellect and exceptional appetite. I took a bite of the veal and decided that, for all the trouble they caused, diamonds really were a detective's best friend provided they were the real thing and provided they eventually went home with someone else. The night was cold, the city was loud, but inside the house on 35th Street, everything was exactly where it belonged.